So the Jews, he's in chapter 10 here, addressing what's going on with the Jews, and he says, look, no, the scripture was near them. And now he's going to ask some questions. He's established that anybody who calls on the name of the Lord can be saved. There's no differentiation between Jew and Greek. And then he says in verse 14, how then will they call upon him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him whom they have not heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes by hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. Now in chapter 10, again, James is just such a big jerk today. In chapter 10, in verse 14, we really like to turn to those verses and say, we need gospel preachers, right? Has anybody else heard it in that context? You come to some meeting, you come to church, and they read that, and they're like, see, we need gospel preachers. That's true. We do need gospel preachers. And you know what? Apparently you're going to have gorgeous feet if you preach the gospel, right? It's really just an idea of that you're bringing good news, that what you're coming with is excellent. That's the idea behind the saying. But this passage is not saying we need preachers. This passage is congruent with the whole rest of the chapter, which is Paul talking about the fact that were the Jews let down? Did they have speakers? And so he's asking the rhetorical questions, the same kind of questions he's been asking all through Romans. And so he's saying, well, hey, how could the Jews call upon them if they didn't have anybody talking about it? And if there wasn't anybody talking about it, how could they talk about it unless somebody sends them? So he's making a case, or what could be a case that someone might say, in order to say the Jews never really had a chance. We know that's what he's saying, especially from the context above, but below, in verse 18, he says, but I ask. In the Greek, it means, but I ask. In other words, when you say but, what are you doing? You're making an exception, right? You're saying blah, 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 but, we went to Disneyland, we did this, we did that, but it was incredibly hot out and I hated it, right? So what you're saying is that this is in contrast to what I've just said. And so he's saying you could ask these questions. What about this? Was there someone to tell them? Did someone equip them to tell them? Did someone send them to tell them? And then he says, but I ask. So in other words, Paul is making a rebuttal to the possibility that no one was there to tell Israel. And he says, but I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have. So he's answering the above argument, including his own. Does that make sense? And he's saying, but I ask, have they not heard? And then he answers himself, indeed they have. And now he's going to quote from the Old Testament. Their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. So in answer to, has Israel been told these things? The answer is yes. Even from their own law and their own covenant, they were told about the coming Messiah, that there would be one that would take away the sin of the world, that would do these things. They knew that that's what Messiah was coming for, even from their Old Testament scriptures. Verse 19, but I ask, did Israel not understand? So he posed the question, well, okay, there were people there that could tell them what's going on, but maybe they didn't understand. Maybe they didn't know what they were saying. And he says, first, Moses said, so the first answer, he says this, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry. So congratulations, you're a foolish nation. The first answer that God gives is this, I'm going to take Gentiles. The idea was foolish, not in like you're all a bunch of idiots or something like that, but foolish in the sense of not knowing God. And so he says, the first demonstration that Paul says is, yeah, they knew because God used Gentiles to show them. And that's different ways, different times. You might recall where Jesus, at one point, the Pharisees want to kill Jesus because he tells them, he says, if you remember back to the days of Elijah, there was only one leper cleansed, and it was Naaman, a Syrian. And so basically what he tells the Jews, he says, you guys could have had all this leper cleansing. You never took advantage of it. The only person in the Old Covenant who was ever healed of leprosy was a Syrian, your worst enemy. And they're all like, oh, no, you didn't. And they go to kill him. So that you have these prophecies where he says, hey, look, I raised up people from Gentile nations to make you jealous to follow after me. Then he says in verse 20, then Isaiah is so bold as to say, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I've shown myself to those who did not ask for me. So this is not only true of Gentiles, but of Jews. He says, look, I'm revealing myself, right? And he says, to Gentiles, I reveal myself. Then in verse 21, he says, but of Israel, he says, all day long I have held out my hands for a disobedient and contrary people. So Paul he concludes this section. He says, look, so the whole, chapter 10 is primarily all about Israel and God's working and their response to the gospel and these different things. But he's finalized it. Even though, and I think that this is an opinion, so feel free to throw it away. But I think that that's why he qualifies in the beginning of chapter 10. And he says, I want you to know that my heart is that these people will get saved. But this is actually how it went down. They rejected God. They've rejected God over and over and over and over and over again for millennia. And he says, I want them to be saved. But this is God's commentary. All day long, I've held my hands out to a disobedient and a contrary people. So does this mean we despise them as a nation? Does this mean we hate them? Does this mean, no, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that at all. I mean, this is just an education for us to understand what went down with Israel, why they rejected God. They sought a righteousness of their own. They tried to make themselves righteous. And in trying to make themselves righteous, they became pompous and rude. And basically, they never fulfilled what God had for them. Not just the promised land, but that they would be a light to the nations. That's what God wanted in Israel. They weren't to just go around and trash everyone. The genocides that occurred when Israel came out of Egypt was to destroy people groups who had gotten so ingrained in sin that God in his sovereignty said they're not going to come back from that. And so they destroyed those nations to preserve a lineage of Christ so that the world could be saved. Which for some of us must be like, oh, God did that? He did do that. And again, that's just evidence of our fickleness. Because on the one hand, we're like, God, why don't you do anything about what's going on? And then he does, and we're like, God, how could you do that? We're wild. And so what happens is those nations are eradicated for the most part. And then from that position, they were to be a light to the whole world of the coming Messiah that would deal with sin. But instead, they sought a righteousness based on their own thing. And so the parallel for us as a church, we can do the same thing. We can have Christ, and we can intellectually understand that, yes, the Christ is the end of the law for me, that my salvation is purely based on what he did, and there's no works involved. I just trusted him, and it was a free gift to me. But then we can start, it's weird, once we kind of get cleaned up a little bit, right? Once we start kind of walking with the Lord, and we're like, oh, wow, okay, I'm walking with the Lord. I'm not smoking anymore, or whatever, I don't care. Just fill in the blank, some habit that we don't like, or whatever. And then we're like, yeah, I'm doing pretty good. And then we can meet people and be like, hey, you can do good like me. Right? I've been doing good. I have a morning time. I've kicked some bad habits. I'm an usher at my church. Come be like me. Because that's the end of seeking our own righteousness. But the righteousness is by faith just says, no, it's Jesus. Every messed up person out there, it's Jesus. And anybody can be saved. Anybody can. And it's near you. It's not far from you. God's not trying to make it hard for you. It's simply, Lord, have mercy on me. It's simply, Lord, you're the Lord. It says, with the heart one believes. I didn't really go over that part for time's sake, but it says, with the heart one believes and is justified. It's the heart.